Thank you all so much for joining us. I know it's 9:15 on a Wednesday and everyone's probably just still a little sleepy, but I'm super excited to have our panel here out in research. Today we're going to be focusing on how PepsiCo, Mondelēz, and Suzy are all approaching LGBTQ research and how we're thinking about just LGBTQ audiences in general. I don't promise to have all the answers for you today, but hopefully what we can do is inspire you to have a conversation at work and at least starting to have some talks with your colleagues about how you can potentially approach this. So today I'm joined by two powerhouses from the insights industry. But I'll let them first introduce themselves. So Nick, why don't you go first?
Sure, good to meet you all in person, which is very exciting. We're not on Zoom or Teams anymore. So I'm Nick Graham, I'm the Global Head of Insights and Analytics for Mondelēz International, which is the company that makes Oreo, Cadbury, Sour Patch Kids, all the fun snacking things we've been enjoying over the last 18 months. So good to see you all.
Hi everyone, I'm Julianna Hessel, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a manager of consumer insights at PepsiCo, specifically working on new platform and long-term innovation. I also hold a role as our LGBTQ ERG's business advisory lead. So I work with other marketing brand teams to advise on research with the LGBTQ community and review upcoming creative and things like that.
Great.
Awesome. And I'm Abel. I am from Suzy. We're a real-time market research platform. And I'm also the lead of our LGBTQ ERG group called Suzy Qs. So I think my first question for you here, maybe just to ground us all, is why is LGBTQ research so important? Why should companies even start thinking about it? Nick, why don't you start us off there?
Because it's the 21st century. No, I think fundamentally, the LGBTQIA+ community, it's a big community, constantly expanding and evolving and changing. I mean, I think we've seen that, particularly over the last couple of years, we've seen such huge changes in the community. I think also we should recognize that it is a big community with big spending power, right? So I think the latest estimate had the spending power of the community in the US alone at about $1 trillion, I think globally about $4 trillion. So it's a community that we can't neglect. And I think, again, we talk about diversity and inclusion increasingly across all of our businesses, and we should treat the LGBTQIA+ community in exactly the same way.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Julianna?
I need to get it out.
It's important.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Nick said, but really I think Gen Z has spoken as well. Gen Z is more likely to identify as part of the LGBTQ community than any generation before. So like Nick was saying, this really is the future. And it's no longer an option to ignore the community or pretend, that this isn't a subset of consumers that we're speaking to in any brand that we have. So now is the time.
Yeah. I think the latest stat has it that almost 30% of Gen Z is, LGBTQ or LGBTQ adjacent. So obviously this is going to be a group that every marketer, every brand person should care more and more about if they want to authentically reach those audiences.
And I was going to say, I think what you also see when you talk to Gen Z and millennials, and particularly the younger end of millennials, is you see a huge understanding and appreciation and respect for LGBTQIA rights as well as a bigger expression of sort of social values and purpose. And so it's not just the 30% of Gen Z who identify, it's the 60, 70% beyond that who also respect the values of the community as well. So you're speaking to a really big audience, not just the group that identify as that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about allies and allyship in the community and how that's just such an important group. How are you guys thinking a little bit about that, maybe at each of your companies? Julianna?
Sure, I think when it comes to finding the best insights to connect with the community, you obviously need to go to the source, people who identify as part of LGBTQ. But when it comes to tracking performance of a campaign you might have launched or a product that's aimed at LGBTQ, it's important to get that halo effect of the allies and really see how is this affecting the broader culture and consumer.
Yeah, definitely. Nick, I think you talked about it, but the LGBTQ community is incredibly diverse. It's not just one letter. It's not just one group of people. It's made up of a collection of a lot of different groups. So obviously this can make it really challenging and sometimes complicated, but where do you see market researchers really go wrong when they start approaching LGBTQ audiences?
So I think to your point, there's a couple of big challenges we face, and I think we've talked about this as well in terms of just finding the audience in the first place, finding the community in the first place. I think another point is just how complicated and complex and multifaceted the community is, right? So to your point, there's no single letter, and I think I've seen bad LGBTQ research in the past where they go, LGBTQ people think this. Well, who are you talking about? Which part of the community are we actually talking about here? I think the other part related also to Gen Z and the increasing changes in the broader community and broader society as well is the increasing intersectionality as well. So what does it mean to be LGBTQ and African American? What does it mean to be that and Asian American, Gen Z? So the intersectionality of those different identities, I think again, in the attempt to try to represent the community, sometimes we oversimplify and forget just how complicated and complex the community is. And I understand, look, as a market researcher, you sometimes have limited time, you have limited budget, you really want to represent the community, but you can't necessarily do every single facet. So one of the things we've said as we share research internally is just reminding people that we're sharing a subset, a snapshot of the community, but this isn't intended to absolutely represent every single facet and different intersectional identity.
Definitely. Julianna, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
I think, Nick said it well, that it really is important to have intersectionality when you're thinking about the consumer. And I think just remembering that these are people who exist in all of the cohorts that you might already be talking about, that you might already be targeting with specific ads or campaigns. And the not including LGBTQ people in that work is a choice on its own. And so it really makes sense to have LGBTQ inclusion in any sort of ad or any sort of campaign.
And the other thing I'd say is remember that everybody's human. I know, shocker, right? But everybody's human. We all have human experiences. And so we'll talk about this, I guess, in a second. But when we did with Aurea, we did the Proud Parent campaign, the Proud Parent piece of work. Hopefully, some of you have seen it. There's this message in that which is about love and acceptance and accepting the person that your child brings home. I mean, that's a human value. Many of us have been through that experience either because we have kids, because we brought somebody home our parents didn't necessarily approve of. So there's a human need and a human motivation behind that is truly universal that we can't lose sight of as well. So understanding what makes the community and the communities unique and distinct and how their experience is different, but also what makes us human and makes us universal as well. Finding that balance, I think, is really key.
Yeah, and I think something interesting that you said there is obviously there's all these intersections here, and it's a very diverse group. And I think probably to the dismay of everyone here, your research budgets are not unlimited. So how do you think about when it makes sense for a certain brand to maybe think about a subsect of the LGBTQ identity that they should reach, and like what does that process kind of look like for you? Joanna?
Oh, sure. I think certainly not every brand has to have a really deep and visible relationship with the LGBTQ community. I think there's certainly understanding who your brand is, what the brand values are, and how that comes to life may or may not be a very obvious connection to the LGBTQ community, but there's still an opportunity, again, to have inclusion and have representation throughout any brand's work. So I would say it ultimately comes down to prioritization of who you're talking to and what that sort of human truth is. And if you can have an opportunity to put an LGBTQ experience in there and connect it to that ultimate goal.
Right, and I think anytime, I'm thinking, when you're doing communication, you're going to have to choose who your subject is, right? So which part of the community you want to represent. Whether when we did Proud Parent, we chose an African American woman bringing her female partner home. Gillette did a really great piece on the guy teaching his trans son how to shave. So you're going to have to choose a topic or a part of the community. I think the key is understanding how does that how does that resonate with the broader LGBTQ community and then the ally group as well? Because even if the experience that you're representing is quite specific, it will resonate with the broader group because people understand that you're trying to use that as a way of representing or speaking to the broader experiences of the community as well. So trying to make sure that as you're building your research plans, understanding which parts of the community you really want to engage with. Do you want to just speak broadly to the community, in which case you need to understand that everybody's experience is not going to be exactly the same. So can you find examples, scenarios, and experiences that can stand for lots of different people in the community?
Yeah, I think maybe a slight shift here, but something that I think I personally see that a lot of brands potentially don't get it right is they only focus on Pride as their kind of central tentpole moment, for the LGBTQ community, forgetting that, I'm a gay man the entire year, not just, 1 month. Yeah, shocker. Once per 1 month per year. So I'm kind of curious, how do you guys think about, how do you be truly authentic, throughout the entire year, not just during the month of June? So maybe Julianna, if you want to kick us off there.
Yeah, I mean, it really is just thinking about that in the first place. And I think there's a tendency to feel like, oh, you have to do something during Pride, everyone else is. But if you just show up during Pride and not the rest of the year, I'm not going to say it's almost worse, but it's almost worse. It sort of feels disingenuous, like you're just jumping on this bandwagon and using people rather than actually creating a connection and building a relationship over time. So as much as you can, sort of work it into a brand's overall strategy, again, not just one time of year.
And I think PepsiCo has done such a good job, I think, of doing that throughout the year. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how do you guys personally go about making sure you're building kind of authentic relationships with the LGBTQ community throughout the year?
Yeah, I think some of the PepsiCo brands have done some really great work, namely Bubbly, the seltzer sparkling water brand. I certainly can't take credit for any of that work, but some of the insights that we try to encourage throughout the organization involve, first of all, getting the audience right, making sure you're talking to the right person when you're gathering those deep insights. And again, the key is deep insights, not just making assumptions. I think it's really easy to think you understand who a community is based on stereotypes that you've seen. And so it really is important to get a deep understanding, and you might be surprised what you find out. There's recently a Bubbly campaign around parenthood, and that was really born out of an insight around people aren't talking about LGBTQ parents. And so that was something that was discovered. And I think along with those deep insights, you need to be able to show the results and again, make sure you're talking to the right audience, tracking with the right audience, and measuring any sort of halo effect you can to promote that within your organization that this is a really beneficial for consumers and for brands.
Definitely. And I was going to say, I think you have to, you talked a lot, Julianna, about pairing the brand that you're talking about with the right issue, the right question, and the right audience. So with Oreo, it's fundamentally about bringing families together, right? That's what the brand has always been about. And so a lot of the work that we've done, both in the US and overseas, is using the questions of parenthood as a way in to talk about it in a way that feels authentic, right? So in the US, we have a long-standing relationship with PFLAG, and we've used that throughout the entire year, not just in the month of Pride. And then all of the work that we're doing is trying to bring to life the experience of what it's like either to be a parent with an LGBTQ plus child, or what it's like to be an LGBTQ plus parent, right? So talking about parenthood and the relationship between parents and children as an authentic way of talking about the experience. And then back to your question earlier, that provides a way in that we can talk to lots of different parts of the community who've had different experiences of that without necessarily just singling out a particular part of the community. So there was some great work that the team did in Brazil, where they actually got different parents with different experiences. So we had a dad, a fashion designer who had adopted 2 kids. And we actually rewrote the children's tales, children's stories in Brazil to represent different experiences that kids had had. So there was one, The Ugly Duckling, we rewrote for kids of LGBTQ plus parents, like what it feels like to be considered the odd one out. So they did a really beautiful piece of work. It was truly authentic, but it kind of goes back to that idea of family and parenthood and bringing people together and not singling people out. And that's exactly as you said, it's important that you don't just show up with the rainbow, but that you show up throughout the entire year and really understand the experiences and issues that people are dealing with.
I think, growing up, I never had a book like that. I think I never had even representation of something like that in media or anything. So it's awesome that I think that brands can start taking a stand. And I think, more and more we see that Gen Z, they want brands to have, some sort of opinion on these kind of topics. And I think even for myself as someone thinking about what products that I'm purchasing, having a brand that kind of stands authentically for who I am, I think is just so critical in that decision making. I think, as we continue to talk about, this community is diverse. You guys have obviously done a little bit of work in this space already, but for brands that haven't really approached LGBTQ audiences, they don't really have the resources. Where do they even get started? How can they even start understanding, what they should and should not be doing?
So I think part of it is understanding, what does your brand stand for? Like, what do you, I use the Oreo example. So what is at the heart of your brand, and how do you want to understand that topic or that issue or that positioning through the lens of the LGBTQ plus community? Because to your point, it's really difficult. I mean, where do you start with any community to really understand the experience? So start with what is true to you. So whether whatever you are, whether you're about bringing families together, whether you're about shaving and what it's like to become a man, like whatever the topic is that's the heart of your brand, take that, I think, as a start point to understand what that experience is like for the LGBTQIA plus community, and then understand how it's different for the different audiences. I mean, there are some incredible resources out there. There are some great partners that I think we both worked with, both research partners and agency partners, who are more than happy to share what they know about the different parts of the community, where they, how they deal with different issues and different topics. So I think starting by just going and asking some questions about the area that you have the most sort of right to talk about is always a good start point. Otherwise, it can just feel a bit overwhelming, and you get all of this information, and where do you start?
Yeah. Julianna, same question to you.
Yeah, I think certainly agree with what Nick said, but there's also some very specific ways that I think you can get started, which is just including questions about whether or not people identify as LGBTQ in a variety of research, pretty much any research you do. That way you might find an insight that you weren't previously looking for. You might see an opportunity with a brand that you weren't previously looking for, and then be able to go from there. And I think, Nick, you kind of touched on this, but finding the right partners to work with, specifically ones that have some sort of expertise in the area, who know how to talk to the LGBTQ community or have a relationship with them, is a really great place to start, because ultimately you do want to have the right voices in the room so that you're avoiding any sort of stereotyping or relying on, old stereotypes that you might be familiar with, and really connecting with the community authentically.
And the other thing I would say is talk to the people in your agency, your company, your community first. I mean, we all probably know somebody who's in the community, or know somebody who knows somebody in the community. So a good start point, even before you start doing research, like research is go and do the day-to-day research and talk to people and ask them about their experiences and their perspectives. So you can start to get a perspective on it there. I know for both of our companies, we have strong employee resource groups dedicated to the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think for both of us, we rely on those throughout the year to better understand the community, but also, I know we've both developed communications designed to reach the community. We bring the Rainbow Council or the PepsiCo ERG into the process as well, so that they feel part of it. They can feedback, because while we're part of the community, not everybody involved in the creation of either research or topics are. And so using that as a guide and make them feel included, make them feel heard, I think is a really important start point.
Yeah. I'll just also say, I think the first step is just having that conversation and starting to think about all of this.
That's very true.
It goes a long way. Obviously, you'll talk to people in your organization and find out what they have to say.
Yeah, and I think even for us at Suzy, this is such a critical part as we think about diversity and inclusiveness within market research. We actually did a recent initiative where we partnered with a queer anthropologist who's really a leading academic in this space to help us kind of pull together a guide of even how to even start thinking about these diverse groups. So, we'll send that out to everyone after this. But, I think one thing that we've been thinking about even more broadly is how do we think about inclusivity in market research? So we know a lot of our brands are coming to us and asking that question of like, how do we think about gender? How do we think about socioeconomic status? How do we think about all these different pieces? So I'm curious from, both your organizations, how are you guys starting to think about that? And how is that kind of coming into your planning for next year? So Julianna, I'd love to kick it off for you first.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of specifically wording of questions that traditionally market research hasn't necessarily been inclusive of the LGBTQ community. I think a great example is asking about gender. And, I've heard a lot of times people say, do I have male, female, other? Do I list out a whole bunch of different gender identities? What's the best way to do this? And a lot of the times the answer might be, you don't even need to ask gender. If that's not something you're going to be looking at the data by, or that's not really important to your goals, then you might not even need to ask. And I think there's something around not just trying to write every single identity you can and make sure they can check that box, but letting people just exist as people and respond to whatever research you're doing.
Definitely. Nick?
And I think challenging ourselves and our research partners to make sure that we're thinking about whatever we're putting out there, because everything we're putting out there, whether it's a piece of research or a piece of communication, is a piece of communication in some way, shape, or form, right? So it's an opportunity to communicate your values and to be inclusive and representative. And I think, sometimes we're in such a hurry to do research when we're doing, really fast, agile research. We're like, okay, let's just get the survey, let's go. Just take 10 minutes and just look at the survey critically and say, how are we asking about gender? Do we really need to ask this? Is there a better way of asking that question? Obviously, we can take a lot of the work that V did, right, to shape how we ask the questions. And just thinking, like, have I got space to ask a question about your LGBTQ identity? We there are very few cases where we wouldn't include maybe gender or ethnic identity as part of the questionnaire, right? Because we might want to look at that as a break. But very rarely have I seen, and we're trying to get much better at this, as include sexual orientation or gender identity as one of those questions. So just stopping for a minute and say, is this something I can spend the time to investigate and explore? Because I know when we've done work together to look at the community, we found some things that really surprised us, right? So some brands that do incredibly well with subsections of the LGBTQ plus community that we would never have known about because we might never have asked for it. But just sometimes just putting in that question, if you have time, you'll find discover something you didn't even know was out there because you never asked the question.
Yeah, I think that's actually super interesting. So maybe even to challenge you a little bit on that, what is something really interesting that you learned even from your own internal research among LGBTQ audiences that was kind of like an aha moment that may have inspired some future, thinking or conversations there?
You want to go first?
Julianna?
I think there's certainly some brands or categories within beverages that you can see are interesting to see, and maybe they make a little bit of sense. I know off the top of my head, like the energy drink category does well with the LGBTQ audience. And I think that's it's something that you might see in practice, but also you don't necessarily think about. Other things that I've seen that are interesting in research, when you actually talk to consumers, I think we have a tendency to think that everyone in the LGBTQ community is very tapped into, the culture and is like commenting online about ads that worked well, ads that didn't. A lot of the time they're just everyday people. They might not remember every single thing that a brand has done, but they will remember when there's something really emotional that stood out, that really spoke to them, that talked about their community. So there's a lot to learn from just talking to people, and again, remembering that they're regular people.
Regular humans.
Regular humans.
As I say, I think a couple of things that sparked, as you were saying. I think one is being really conscious of when you're doing research with the LGBTQ community and then you're creating communication or innovation or whatever it is to reach that audience, is just being careful that that it doesn't come across as sort of either rainbow washing, or it doesn't come across as sort of as somehow exploitative, right? That we're trying to use it as a way to reach an audience. And so, I think both of the cases, what we've tried to do is, if you're putting out communication, make sure that you're pairing it with actual action. So, the partnerships that we have with PFLAG and with other organizations, make sure that you're actually backing up with action. Because I know whenever I sit in focus groups with LGBTQ plus consumers and you show a piece of communication, they're like, great, what are you actually doing for the community? And so remembering this isn't just a communication exercise, this is about really helping support the community, as you said, throughout the year. And then the other thing that always strikes me is, I know when we did the research on the Oreo Proud Parent campaign, the thing that surprised me the most, I expected or hoped that our LGBTQ consumers would love the ad and feel really represented. What amazed me is just the pride and the excitement you got from non-LGBTQ plus consumers. So the fact that it felt like finally a brand was talking about this thing, even if it's not something that had personally affected them, it was like, finally you're doing something, you're saying something, you're making a point about this, and I can see this as a bigger point about values. And also because, here's another shocker, non-LGBTQ plus people know people in the community, right? And so they're, it may not be them, but their friend or their relative is a part of the community. And increasingly so, right, as we talk about the changes in the generations. So I think it's really that, sometimes I know early on in my career, when I tried to talk about the community, people would say, it's like 7% of people or 6% of people. They'd throw out a statistic like, is that really worth even talking about? Well, first of all, it's much bigger than that, and increasingly so, but also the potential reach and the resonance that you get beyond just the community, that's the real opportunity for us to speak to a much broader audience of allies.
Yeah, and I think even from my personal perspective, when you see brands who are able to not just, put up a rainbow flag, but actually think about, how do you authentically feel included? How do you feel connected to people? I think those are such human, messages for everyone. So maybe just kind of one other question for you is, hopefully you're in a room of people who now feel a little bit more inspired to kind of go back into their organizations and think about it. What's kind of one final piece of advice for them to make sure that, they're not doing this in a performative way and they kind of have a good, solid way forward? So Julianna, I'd love for you to start with that.
I think a lot of the things that we've already said, in that getting the right voices in the room, thinking about this year long, not just during Pride, is really key to that authenticity piece, and making sure that you're talking to the right folks and you're asking the right questions ultimately, and working in the LGBTQ community into your overall strategy for your brand. Not just one point in the year.
Yeah, no, I think that's said it brilliantly. I think fundamentally, it's, as you say, you need to make it part of how you do business, right? And how you think about your brands, how you grow your brands. And it's not just like this thing over here, like, I guess it's Pride Month, so we'll do the rainbow. It's like, this is part and parcel of how we do research, how we develop our brands. And I think you talked about this when you were saying about that, which is, I think, start with, because I know it can feel a bit overwhelming and we don't all have, as you said, unlimited budgets and time, but just start with bringing people in the company and who can speak to the experience. So just start by doing your own internal research to understand the experience and get some momentum behind that. And I think that can be a great way. And just, go out and do a quick bit of qualitative research and just try and start to learn in a safe, quick and easy way, and just start to build the momentum that way. Like, it's the classic case of you won't start until you start. So just start and then you'll start the momentum going.
Yeah, and I think something that's so critical to that is coming from a place of actual curiosity and wanting to learn more versus like, hey, like I want to hit my numbers. Let me make sure that we just like tap into that audience during that time. So I know that, as we think about it, there's, people in general can sense if your brand is just doing something just for Pride. There's this meme that went around the day after Pride where it's just like showing every brand changing their social media away from the Pride logo. So I think people are smart. They can sense when you're doing things inauthentically. So I just want to say thank you both for having this conversation. Hopefully everyone here feels a little bit more inspired to go back into your organizations, think really critically about what this means for the brands that you either work with or for your own individual brands. And hopefully, as time goes on, this becomes more something that's on the forefront of research. So yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you all for taking the time for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.